The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, education, and religion. We'll explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Elinor Tatum, publisher of the famed New York Amsterdam News. How you doing, Ellie?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, this is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Amsterdam News. You weren't around then, and neither was I, but let's talk about how it got founded, who were the founders, how it developed over these years from 1909.
Yes, it was founded in December of 1909, and it was founded by a gentleman named James Anderson, who in his apartment with his wife, her dressmaker's table, 4 sheets of paper, and a pencil, started the newspaper on 65th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. So
that was where black folks used to live at that time.
Yeah, it was the San Juan
Hills district.
The San Juan Hills section, which was actually raised to create Lincoln Center.
Mm-hmm.
So it was founded in 1909, and very quickly it moved up to Harlem, to 135th Street. And it has been in Harlem ever since. So since, the teens, it has been in Harlem. And it started as this, 4 sheets of paper. It was a broadsheet, and it just grew and grew. It was founded the same year that the NAACP was. So if you look at the years of 1909, 1910, 1911, there was so much happening within the black community here in New York and around the country.
Now, the original black newspapers, going back to Freedom's Word and John Rushworm back in the 19th century, were to alert black people to things that were happening to them and how they could mobilize themselves to fight racism and to fight discrimination. And that was particularly around 1909 when the NAACP was founded. So then, as the paper began to evolve, I asked you before if you had any copies of the original paper. Well, paper falls apart, you don't have those. The first copies you actually have on microfilm from 1922.
Correct, yes.
Now, what was happening in 1922 other than the fact that I was born then?
Well, that was the most important thing that happened in 1922 is the fact that you were born.
To me it was, that's for sure.
But I wanted to go back to John Rushworm for a moment and Freedom's Journal, because their first editorial that was on the front page of their newspaper said, "We choose to plead our own cause, for too long have others spoken for us." Mm-hmm. And what that says, that's the mantra of all black newspapers today. It is talking about the community, for the community, from the community's perspective. Because still today, others are still speaking for the black community. We leaders are anointed in our community and not elected from our community. And if you and I both know that the true leaders of our community are not necessarily the people that are the talking heads out there, but it's the church pastor, the grandmother that lives on the corner, the school principal. Those are the people that really hold our communities together and are the leaders in our community and make sure that our young people end up going somewhere. So we celebrate all of those heroes within our newspaper every week. And that is something that we've done, for a century now.
Now, is the Amsterdam News the oldest black newspaper?
It's one of the oldest continuously published black newspapers. There are some other newspapers that claim to be older, that claim to be continuously published. I can't prove or disprove that, but we've got newspapers. The Philadelphia Tribune says they're 125 years old now. The Baltimore Washington African is also around the same age. So we've got some old newspapers out there, and they're still around and they're still serving their communities proudly.
But during the days of segregation, which many people in our audience don't even remember, fortunately, because of the Civil Rights Movement, but during the days of segregation, the black newspapers were the main way in which the black community learned about what was happening in the world to African Americans in sports and drama and theater and so on. At one time, there were several hundred African American newspapers. Almost every small town had a newspaper.
Right.
And of course, the big cities like New York with Amsterdam, Pittsburgh with the Courier, Chicago with the Defender, Washington, Baltimore with the African American, Norfolk Journal and Guide, the Kansas City Call where Roy Wilkins used to work. Those are the places that mobilized both the average person and the black intellectuals to figure out how to fight this racism.
Right.
And of course, the civil rights movement, finally the mainstream media, the white media, began to have black reporters cover the black community. But still now, how many black newspapers are there in the country now?
There's still over 200 black newspapers in the country. The National Newspaper Publishers Association is the association that is the trade organization for those black newspapers. And we meet 3 to 4 times a year to discuss the issues of the black press. And all those newspapers that you just mentioned are still in existence today. And they're still doing that job of pleading our own cause. But one of the things that happened was during the civil rights movement and before that, the only place, as you said, that you could get news about the black community was in the black press. The National Newspaper Publishers Association actually had correspondents during World War II that were off overseas reporting back as to what the black troops were doing. Because
so
nobody...
That's the only way you
right.
got it.
I mean, nobody talked about the Tuskegee Airmen except for the black newspapers.
That's exactly right.
And, you know, imagine the way New Yorkers felt when they saw on the front page of the Amsterdam News, you know, Roscoe C. Brown. And,
yeah, that's a big article. When
yes,
I shot
exactly.
down.
I've seen copies of that. You know, the fact is, and the hometown news was coming back to our hometown and telling what our black soldiers and heroes were doing overseas, because we didn't exist in the mainstream newspapers. And that's why the black press and the Amsterdam News in particular has been so important, because we have been the record of the black community, of births, of deaths, of marriages, of accomplishments, whether they be the Tuskegee Airmen or an astronaut or a doctor
or Joe Louis.
Joe Louis, yes, you know, Jackie Robinson. You know, it was the black press, it was the Amsterdam News, whose reporters were traveling with the Negro League. We were the ones that were in the locker rooms and at the same hotels that Jackie Robinson was at, because he couldn't stay in the hotels with the rest of his team members. So we've told that story from the inside. Now, as segregation ended and as the civil rights movement happened, advertisers before that always had to advertise in the black press, because African Americans were not reading the mainstream newspapers.
That's right. But then when it shifted over, some of the advertising drifted.
Well, yes, and that was actually part of the downfall of the black press, and some of the things that have led to the black press not being as strong as it once was, because we don't have the same advertising dollars that we once had. Because advertisers felt, well, you know, blacks are integrated now, you know, the civil rights movement is over, we can just advertise in the mainstream dailies and we can get to the same people. But the fact is that the black community does not trust those newspapers the way that they trust their black newspapers. They don't see it and hold it in the same regard as they do the black press. So if they see an ad in the Amsterdam News and they see an ad in the Daily News, you know, the product that's advertised in the Amsterdam News is one that they're probably going to pick up over the one that's in the Daily News, because they have a stronger affinity towards the outlet that it's in.
Now, when you sell your advertiser, or your staff sells the ad, you make that point, I'm sure.
Of course we do.
And of course, the Amsterdam News and many of the black press has many more turnovers. You buy one, but the one you buy might be turned over 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. In addition to which, many of the stories that are done in Amsterdam end up in the mainstream press, both the electronic media and the print media, where they're as quoted in the New York Amsterdam News, which means the paper is providing a major service to the community. Now, the person who helped to keep the Amsterdam News moving was your father, Bill Tatum, my good friend. You sat here, we talked before on our show. Tell me about how it feels to be the daughter of Wilbert Tatum, who led the Amsterdam News through tough times and great times, to now take over and do this job. How does it feel?
Well, it feels great that he trained me well enough and had enough faith in me to leave that newspaper as his legacy to me to keep going on. And that makes me very proud. And at the same time, a little bit sad that he's not here with me. But
he's here, he's right on your shoulder.
Yes, he is, he is. But I enjoy the work that I do, and I know that it's so important. And every day I strive to make him proud. And when I'm writing the editorials, I hear his voice. And he says, got to make that stronger. Go after them, girl.
Yeah, I read your first editorial you wrote after Bill passed away, and it was a very tender and soft editorial. And then the next few weeks, the volume began to accelerate, and I read one last week. I said, that's something that Bill would have written,
Yep.
which is, it's an advocacy. One of the reasons for the existence of the black press is advocacy. The other reason is information. And that's difficult, because how do you keep advocacy out of information when in some times the information says you ought to be advocating? How do you do that? How do you balance that issue?
Well, I mean, the editorial page is where we really do the advocacy. It's where we do the endorsements. It's where we talk about issues in a non-objective sort of way, where I say, this is how we feel as a newspaper, and this is what we think you should do. Within the pages of the newspaper itself, in the news pages, we tell the story as it's happening, both sides of it, whether we agree with it or not. We let people know, because the only way that people can make informed decisions is if they know both sides of the story. So we give them that information so that they can make their own decisions.
Well, I know you cover the Caribbean, you cover Africa, you cover the communities of Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, Manhattan, and Staten Island. How are you able to jam all of that into a few pages in the Amsterdam News?
It's very hard, and we have to make hard decisions because there's so much more we would like to cover. You know, at the end of the day, if we had more advertising, we'd be able to have more pages so we could cover more things.
That's a good sales talk. Very good. Well, it is true. Now, to what extent do you depend on the news service? Like the National Associated Negro Press has a news service that
we tend not to use it that often. We will use it when there's a national story that's happening somewhere else that the newspaper that's in that area can cover it much better than we can, or when there are some White House stories that are coming out of there. But one of the things that we've found is that, why do you pick up the Amsterdam News if we're going to have the same news as everyone else does?
That's a good point.
So we try to do original stories as much as we can, but when there is stuff out there that we really believe needs to be picked up from the news service, we will. That's one of the reasons why we don't use AP stories, the Associated Press stories. We may use their photographs every once in a while, but you will never see us using an AP story.
Now, what about coverage of the White House? How do you do your coverage of the White House?
Well, a lot of times we use the National Newspaper Publishers Association for that, but at the same time we have had Herb Boyd on Air Force One with President Obama.
Yeah, I read that story.
Yes, so, you know, we have had access. And, you know, we have met with the president on several occasions. And so, you know, we are writing about the White House from right here in New York and also from D.C. as well.
Now, in the entertainment and the cultural world, which has always been a mainstay of the black press, what do you cover and how do you cover it?
Well, we try to, I mean, there's so much out there in the world of entertainment, but one of the things we especially try to cover is the smaller productions and things that are going on right here in the Harlem and Brooklyn and New Jersey communities, where our stars are really born. You know, the National Black Theater and Ujima Black Theater and the galleries that are up here and the Apollo Theater. These are all places where our youngsters start out and blossom from there. And so the stages of Harlem have been the training ground for our great, great actors.
Now, I read the other day that the political and cultural power of African Americans is shifting from Harlem to Brooklyn. First of all, how do you feel about that? And secondly, what is your reaction, or the paper's reaction, to the fact that there are probably more black people who live in Brooklyn than live in Harlem?
You know, we cover both. We cover all of them. And, you know, wherever the power is, we will follow it. And we write about Brooklyn as much as we write about Harlem. And these politicians that we cover and that we talk to, we're going to talk to them wherever they are.
Well, given the 100-year history of the Amsterdam News, which started and thrived in Harlem, and the fact that so much of black culture has started and thrived in Harlem, it's logical that you keep focusing back on the cultural aspects of Harlem. But what about the cultural aspects of Southeast Queens, the cultural aspects of the Bronx, of Williamsbridge, of Bed-Stuy? How do you deal with that?
Well, you know, we try to cover as much as we possibly can.
And if you had more advertising, you could cover more.
And we had more reporters, we could cover more as well. But we try to get the stories out there that about all the different areas of the city, because there's such a rich African American culture in all of the boroughs, including Staten Island, which we always forget about. But we do get Staten Island covered. We do get Southeast Queens covered. We do talk about what's happening in Brooklyn and in Long Island. So, you know, we are cognizant of what's going on, and could we do more? Of course we could. We could always do more, but we do our very best to try to get all of the communities covered.
Historically in the press, the front part of the newspaper is hard news and the back part is soft news, mainly sports. And the Amsterdam News for years has covered Jesse Owens and covered the black colleges, covered Joe Louis, covered Jackie Robinson, covered Muhammad Ali, etc. And you have Howie Evans, who's been on the show, sports editor, who has done a great job keeping that page alive.
Yes.
To what extent do you think that the black community really relies on the sports section of the Amsterdam to know about what's happening in local sports? Well, what's happening with that?
Well, I do believe that we are the only place that really covers black local sports in this city, because there really isn't a lot more out there. But besides that, you know, we cover the Harlem Little League. I don't think the Harlem Little League is really talked about anywhere else.
Nowhere else.
Yeah,
really.
the Pee-wee basketball leagues and the football teams and things like that. Not Rucker Park. Not much is spoken about that outside of the black community. You may get 1 or 2 stories a year out of the other newspapers about it, but there's not continuous coverage. So we provide that. But what we also cover is the national sports, but we cover it from a perspective of what's happening within the black community and those national sports figures.
And one thing I noticed, you have a lot of pictures in the sports section, action pictures, but actually pictures of little leagues and pictures of basketball, women's games and so on. And you do a good job of covering women's sports as well. I notice you have one particular report, I think Lois Elfman, who does that for you. So that reaches out to the community itself. Now, if someone wanted to give an announcement about something that is happening, how would they get in touch with Amsterdam? How would you make a selection as to whether you're going to cover that story or not?
Well, you know, we get hundreds of press releases every day and every week. And, you know, we try to cover as much as we can, but, you know, you send it into the paper and, you know, we take a look at it, and if we can find someone to cover it, we will. If it's something that we can put into the community calendar, we will. So, you know, it's perseverance and persistence.
Yeah, speaking about your community calendar, that's a very good feature of the paper. What is the purpose of that? How do you establish that?
Well, the purpose of it is to let the community know what's going on, and we have a more robust calendar which was online.
What's your online address?
www.amsterdamnews.com.
And you can find this online calendar as well.
And you can find the entire paper online through our e-edition, as well as the main stories.
Now, what impact do you think this e-edition is going to have on, I was reading the paper that some of the big papers are laying off people in the newsroom and so on because of the fact that they don't have advertising shifting over to the internet. To what extent will Amsterdam get into this?
Well, I think one of the issues and the differences between the Amsterdam News and other newspapers is, number one, we're smaller to begin with, and our overhead is not quite as high as something like the New York Times. And while we are going to go to the internet and have a good internet presence, which we already do have, we're going to keep around a print edition for a good long time. One of the reasons why I think we'll be able to do that is that we're in a city like New York. And as you know, New York is a commuter city. We're on the subways, we're on the buses. And people like to have a newspaper in their hands when they're on the mass transit. So I do believe that newspapers will have a longer lifespan here in a city like New York.
And the papers pass through the beauty shops and the barber shops and the restaurants, which is part of the pass-along readership that you get, because there are very few places where you get community news, and that's true with the larger white community, because I understand there are 100 or so community newspapers right in New York City, in Queens and and Murdoch even has bought up some of those.
He's bought a lot of them up.
So that that gets another
but you see,
intrusion.
Well, one of the things that you will find is with black newspapers, as you said earlier, that pass-along rate is so much higher. But if you look around, if you look at a subway and you see people reading the Amsterdam News and the Daily News and the Post and whatnot, when they leave the subway, you see their newspapers on their seats. The people take the Amsterdam News with them.
That's true.
You don't see an Amsterdam News in the garbage. It's passed on and held on to. You know, I have friends that get the newspaper at their office, and if they don't get it immediately, when they do get it, it's all cut up and they can't find pieces of it because people have taken it and taken things out of it because they want to keep what's in there.
And now, we talked about the 100 years of Amsterdam. As a researcher and a historian, I wonder what you're doing to keep those archives alive, because there's so much rich material in the archives of the Amsterdam.
Yes.
You could write a book, 100 years of the Amsterdam. Maybe
well, we're actually really excited about what's going on now, because we are in the process of creating the archives of the Amsterdam News, which will be named after my father, the Wilbur A. Tatum Archives. And to that end, we have a foundation called the Amsterdam News Educational Foundation, which will be having a celebration on November 30th, where we're going to be honoring people like Hillary Clinton, Charles Rangel, Don Peebles, Bill Lynch, and Bobby Kennedy Jr. Are all going to be our honorees at the Koch Theater, which is actually where the Amsterdam News was originally, on 65th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, so at Lincoln Center.
Now, if people in the audience want to get information about this, where would they get the information about this function?
They would get information by contacting us at the Amsterdam News, and then we would give them information about who's doing this event. You know, we're looking for corporate sponsorship at this point, and it's going to be a wonderful event. It's really going to look at the history of the Amsterdam News and the legacy, and it's all to raise money for this archive that will be housed on 126th Street, which will be open to the general public as well as scholars and researchers and students.
You have a tremendous plethora of things to include in there.
Yes.
Who's going to do your archiving?
Well, we are currently looking for the proper people that will be doing that. We're going to be working on some grants to be able to put this archives together in the best possible way that will make it available to the most people possible.
Well, some of the universities, I'm sure, would be interested in collaborating with you on this.
And we're talking with all of the New York City universities at this time.
The City University, Columbia University, New York University, Fordham University, particularly since the work that Bill Tatum did in the city covered so many communities and so many populations. So I don't think you have any difficulty getting people to collaborate. The main thing is I want to see those archives. I want to find out what's happening, what happened.
Well, we're working on that every day, and so hopefully soon we will have something there that the world can see.
Okay, we had 100 years from 1909 to 2009. In 2109, you and I won't be here, but where do you think the Amsterdam will be? Let's take it short term,
well,
10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Well, you know, someone asked me that the other day, and as I said, I think newspapers will still be around. I think they're going to be changed a little bit, and I imagine something kind of like what you see in Harry Potter, with a newspaper that actually changes the pictures and the cover in your own hands. So, you know, something that's not quite a Kindle, but not quite a newspaper, but is kind of flexible. And I think that's where I would love to see newspapers go.
Well, what about the need for a African-American focused media outlet like the Amsterdam? What do you think? Do you think that really still be as much needed now then as now?
I think maybe even more so, because if you look at the media landscape, there are fewer and fewer people of color at these newspapers, at these magazines, the radio stations, and on the TV stations. You know, and if we don't have people of color making the decisions as to what's to go on the front page of these newspapers, at the leads of these newscasts, then we're going to need the black press, because people are still not telling our story.
But the fact is that because of the changing in the patterns, many of our big cities are predominantly minority. increase intermarriage, many mixed people like Obama. So the world is not, it's going to be different in 100 years. It's not going to be quite as focused. It's not going to be as black and white.
But there's still going to be issues that are going to be, that go right to our community. And we're still going to have a community. It's not going to go away.
Oh, yeah.
The color may change, but the issues are going to remain. And again, until we have people in positions of power at all of these other media outlets, we're going to need the black press. I mean, if there had been people of color at the New York Post when that cartoon came out, do you think it would have ever seen the light of day?
Of course not.
But there aren't people that are the filters that need to be there. And so we need to be there to counter things like that, because those images that exist aren't just going to go away overnight because we have a black president.
Well, that's true. The problems of the world are not going to change because we have a black president. But I think that the contribution that Amsterdam News made, Bill Tatum's made, that you have made, make a difference in our community. And what we wanted to talk about to our audience is 100 years of challenge and excellence of Amsterdam News. And today on African American Legends, we've been talking about Elinor Tatum, publisher of the New York Amsterdam News, celebrating its 100th anniversary. Thanks for being with us, Ellie.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.